Well, I remember that incident. And the reason why I wound up at the hotel that night, and then he said that I showed up and that I was not, for some reason or other, I was mad at him or something, or I was mad at him, but that I had said something that had upset him, and he punched me out, and we got in a fight, and he punched me out. Truth of the matter is, I remember this distinctly. I was staying at another hotel, and I get this call to get over to the hotel because Stefan and Theo had completely destroyed their room in a fucking, drugged up stupor. Trashed their room, trashed everything in it. They were out of control. And now, prior to that, we had problems with them because of their addiction. But this was bad news. So the motel owner wanted to kick everybody out at that point. So I show up. It was a cold night, and sure enough, he was high as a kite. And it's true that he threw a punch, and I threw a punch back. And before I knew it, but that was the reason why I was on top of him, bashing his head into the asphalt driveway where we met in front of the hotel. And then a number of other crew members broke us up. But I would have killed them that night if they hadn't done so. So there was that. That was difficult to deal with. But at other times, he was so vulnerable, that I just wanted to embrace him and protect him as much as I possibly could. But because of his addiction, it proved to be pretty difficult, because it's hard to be there for someone who's addicted. So again,
what ended up on screen? What do you think of?
I think he's good in the film. I think he's weird. I think he's beautifully conflicted, and I think that they're in the seduction scene particularly. You can see that he's shaking a lot. He has blotches on his back. I don't know if this was related to the drug use or if it was something else, but during the course of making the film, there were times when he was always professional. He always delivered and did his best, but he was out of his mind due to this problem he had. Now, there was something else I wanted to say about Funeral Evil and the casting. Oh, here's a story. As to Kathleen, I can't even remember her name, Kathleen McAllen, who played Julie Gabrielle, the young girl in the film. She was not my first choice for that role. My first choice for that role, believe it or not, was Melanie Griffith. Now, Melanie Griffith had done The Drowning Pool with Paul Newman. And I'd never seen the film. I don't think I've ever seen the film. I hadn't seen it then, but I knew she'd done that and a couple of other small things. But she came in and read. I knew who she was. So she had a, quote, name only to the extent that she was up and coming. She wasn't. And I wanted her for the role. And I offered her the role. And she wanted to do it. But because of the budgetary restraints, we had made deals with the actors on a favored nations basis, meaning everybody got scale plus 10, no matter who you were on the show. And as long as we stuck to that and everybody was treated the same, the actors were willing to go along with that, and SAG was willing to go along with that. So I couldn't pay her, even though she had a bit more prestige behind her. Her agent wanted more money, is essentially what it got down to. And her agent told her that she couldn't do it, basically, and she bawled her eyes out. And I remember I spoke to her on the phone, whether she called me or I called her one last time in the process. Did I really want to do this? I love this. I want to work with you, but they're telling me I can't do this, and that's why she didn't do it. But that might have been very interesting to have her on board. I don't think she would have been very happy with what happened to the film. ultimately, uh, but but she was my first choice, and she wanted to do the film.
Yeah, very cool that she was so into it.
Yeah.
Seeing that she wasn't.
Well, she was a kid. We were all kids. We were just kids, you know. And of course, why wouldn't she be into it? She was just a kid. She had a shot at doing at a leading role. She hadn't had that, you know, in a feature film. Hey, listen, you know, Coppola Coppola started with his first, I believe his first feature was for Corman was Dementia 13, which he managed to piece together, you know, as a result of using making a deal to use some other sets that had been prior used and whatever. Most first films, quite frankly, don't amount to much. I mean, there are occasional exceptions, but most of the time, you know, you're allowed to stumble. Not all the time with your first film. I got nailed pretty badly with Fear No Evil. I didn't get much of a break after that. I had to make my own break.
Another surprising element of Fear No Evil is it has a pretty stacked soundtrack of punk and new wave bands from the time. How did you choose and secure those songs?
Well, I have to credit Don Borchers with that because I wasn't particularly keen on those songs. Um, he had a friendship with, and I've forgotten who this was, what record company it was, but the guy who is this guy had was in control of licensing for all of these groups. I've forgotten what company it was, and so he was a music industry mogul. And he talked to this guy and managed to convince him to make a buyout deal, and basically said he talked to me about this, and he said, "Look, here, take a listen to these groups." And he got me a bunch of albums like the Boomtown Rats and all the groups that I ultimately wound up selecting these cuts from for the film. So I listened to all of these groups and found these cuts that I liked. And Don probably directed me toward cuts that he liked as well that I thought might work. And then he made a buyout deal, and we paid $10,000 for everything, all of the music licensing in the film. Lots of people really enjoyed those cuts. The problem with the needle drops, I think, with some of those cuts is that they're too right on lots of the time. Like, for example, I Am the Antichrist, you know, and he's up there. Nonetheless, it was a great song, you know, and I thought, I didn't feel comfortable laying that in there, but at the same time I thought, well, it could be cappy enough to play anyway, you know, and maybe it'll work. But I wasn't a big fan of those groups. I was a fan of David Spears and brought him in to work with me to help me compose the score for the full orchestral score for the film. And to create that, when I was in New York working on the work print cut, I had purchased a Korg polyphonic analog synthesizer, and I began to play with it and create all kinds of analog sounds. And then I got myself a 4-track reel to reel and started laying down and mixing these varied themes and motifs that I had in mind for Fear No Evil. And then when it got time to score the picture, I told Avka that I wanted to score it, but I needed somebody to work with me. And so they were good about that. They were okay with the idea of my scoring the film. And I brought David on, and David was magnificent, and we worked very, very closely together. But those themes and motifs for Fear No Evil began with in New York with that analog synth, you know, and the 4-track. Then when I got out to LA, David and I got together once the picture was locked. For Lady in White, it was an entirely different situation. By then, everything had become digital, and there was a machine called the Yamaha DX7, which was all digital. It was not analog. And I discovered that I could create symphonic instruments or approximate them digitally. They were sampled digitally. These woodwinds and these brass, the brass woodwinds, and strings on this machine. So it was great because when the picture was locked, I locked myself up in another office, another adjacent room in my office, which I always planned to use for this, on Melrose, where we were cutting the picture on Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles. And I built my studio there. I had my DX7. This time I had a 16-track, half-inch, and a 4-track for mixdown. And Lady was simply coded on VHS, and everything was interlocked. Because there wasn't any way to do it via Cubase or any of these platforms that are available for computers now to score and create music with. But I stayed in there for about 6 weeks and created the score. All of the arrangements were done with the DX7, mixing down from the 16-track all the brass, woodwinds, strings, percussion that I had created to a simply coded VHS. So it was like scoring the picture in a studio to picture, which is the way it should be done ultimately. But then, of course, all I had was the digitally sampled synth arrangements. So then I brought John Massari in, who was a wonderful orchestrator, and he took them and orchestrated them and brought them to life. And that was one of the best days for me making Fear No Evil, was going into the studio and recording that score with full orchestra. It was great. It was beautiful.
Yeah, that's
Can we take a break now?
We have to take a break.
Yeah, that was.
We're good. Okay, we're good.
So, Frank, my last question about Fear No Evil. Why do you think it still resonates with fans today?
I hope it does with some. I think there are people that I've come across, fans, 80s horror fans. I have a number of Facebook friends who are 80s horror fans and who really love the film, Why does it resonate today? I don't know. Maybe it's because there's just that very personal aspect of it that I was talking about. It's interesting because the people that are particularly inclined to love Fear No Evil are gay. So either they respond to it because they consider it campy enough, to have fun with, or it genuinely moves them in as to their own coming out struggles. I could see that being a part of it. There are these guys that I think they're called Scream Queens that recently did a podcast related to the film. And I listened to a little bit of it, but it was clear to me that they were just going to kill the film, just tear it apart and be ridiculously, stupidly campy and bitchy about it, and that was their modus operandi. I guess that's the way their podcast works. That doesn't interest me at all. I've never been a fan of bitchy, gay humor or that kind of attitude. It's never appealed to me. But in this particular case, they were discussing Fear No Evil. But there are, I think, fans of the film who are gay that perhaps, as I said earlier, identify with the struggle that I was going through. That's there in the film as a gay man, maybe, and maybe get a certain thrill out of it for its gothic elements as well. I mean, it has a nice gothic feel. I wanted it to have a Hammer horror feel about it, and we did it for very little money.
Yeah, it's very impressive. Obviously, Lady in White and Fear No Evil are quite different films, but they have a very York setting, the autumnalness of everything, and nostalgia for the 1960s specifically. So, what is it about Rochester and your upbringing there that continues to speak to you as an artist?
Well, I was brought up there, and my particular circumstances, as relates to my upbringing, my Italian American heritage, happen to be just what they are, you know. So, but being brought up in Rochester specifically, and how did that influence me? More than anything else, I would say the tone of both pictures, as relates to the seasonal feel. You know, we also shot Fear No Evil. We began during the fall and then moved into the winter months. Lady, I always knew I wanted to have this fall kind of feel and pastoral kind of feel about it, and that season, of course, is spectacular in upstate New York. So I can't think of anything more than that, you know, when it comes to the two films that Rochester had any influence over, really. My heritage, my family, that is what it is. I grew up in Rochester, and they all lived there, but that was just our place. You know, it wasn't who we were.
Sure. But a big influence on Lady in White, at least this is what is reported, is that it draws elements from a local legend in Rochester.
Yes, well,
Accurate? Maybe you want to tell that story.
well, once again, after Fear No Evil, it was 7 years between Fear No Evil and Lady in White before I got back behind the camera again. After Fear No Evil, quite frankly, for a long time, I didn't want to even think about ever making a movie again. It was that disappointing. And I was pitching pencils, selling office supplies after Fear No Evil was released. And I did it for a week. And they were going to write me a check for $20, you know, for my week's worth. That's how well I did. And I didn't take the $20. I just left, and I said, that's it. And I decided I'm not ever, ever, ever going to do anything like that again. So I wound up working for Ed Montoro, of all people, at Film Ventures, which is a real low-budget house. Ed was a nice guy, though. We got along fairly well. And re-edited pictures, a couple of pictures for him that he had picked up, very low-budget films. And then I did whatever I could in that regard, you know, to just keep going. But getting back to, what was the question now? I forgot what the question was.
So Lady in White obviously has some autobiographical elements,
Okay.
and it's based on a local legend from
Right.
Rochester.
Every town's got a Lady in White, or maybe not every town, but they're all over the place. You know, every culture or subculture has a Lady in White story. So we had ours. It never really interested me, the story specifically in and of itself, as relates to our legend of the Lady in White. I knew the place where she seemingly appeared. I'd been to this place. It was on the lake, lovely park on the lake that I used to love to go to, just to relax, think, read, walk around. And but I remember my cousin Charlie coming to me and saying, you know, we may be able to do something again if we put together the money in a fashion that would involve going public and selling penny stocks. And I thought, what the hell is that? He said, what could we do? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, let's think about it. So I thought about it, and I thought about this legend. It came to mind, but I knew that what I wanted to do this time was really try to make something that was personal on an autobiographical level, something that I could completely wrap my arms around, that I'd lived, and that had a real lived-in feel for me. So the first image that came to mind for Lady in White was this image of Frankie in the cloakroom, being locked in the cloakroom. So the whole idea began to gel around that image. That was the first thing it hit. I remembered the cloakroom when I was Frankie's age. I felt it was a scary place. It was as depicted in the film. In my public school, 4th grade, 3rd grade, we had these things. And then I started to think about what I wanted to do was I wanted to make a film that had to do with my upbringing, that had to do with people I loved that were no longer there, people I knew, people I could write about and flesh out due to having lived that experience. I wanted it to be real, but it had to be commercial. And so the idea of combining the two, a ghost story, this legend with all of that, because the legend surrounded me when I was growing up as well. Everybody knew it. Seemed to be a good starting point. And the ghost story aspect was what was going to make it commercial. But the thing about it is that the ghosts in the film are really my ghosts, you know. They're the ghosts from my past. When I started to understand this, ghosts of people like the characters that I created that were based on my grandparents, my father, my teacher in public school, my buddies. They were all people that haunted me, you know, and continued to haunt me. And so it all seemed to click in that regard. I could make a beautiful story about what it was like growing up in that era, and combine it with this ghost story, you know, that drives it thematically, and perhaps more so commercially to make it viable in the commercial sense. And in this regard, they would all gel because they were my ghosts, you know, and the ghosts that of legend all coming together, and it did all come together. It was a remarkable experience, such a far cry from Fear No Evil, from the word go. And I must say that the thing is, without Fear No Evil, Lady in White would never have happened, ever. Because I needed to have at least one other feature behind me before I could make my move to make Lady. And Fear No Evil, for better or worse, turned out to be that. So I had I had a rep. You know, I could make a feature film, for better or worse, whatever you thought of Fear No Evil, I could do it. You know, I'd proven that I could do it. So now the game was how do we do this? I wrote the screenplay, and we determined the budget to be at $4.7 million. How do we raise $4.7 million this time, as opposed to the $540 we raised with Fear No Evil? We had to take another $300 from Avco to finish the picture, and that's how I lost the picture creatively. How do we do that and get all the money I need and take it all the way to completion without any studio involved until the picture's done, when I have to make the deals, without any pre-sales, no Hollywood nonsense, none whatsoever. And I insisted upon that. Well, Charlie came up with this idea of going public. Now, my cousin Charlie was a Wall Street whiz. He wrote a stock market newsletter that was very well regarded. And he based himself in Rochester. He wrote articles for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle weekly. He had a weekly column, finance column. And when we grew up more like brothers than cousins. We were together quite a bit. We loved each other dearly. He was three years older than me. And so he said, well, you know, I think we might be able to do this by selling penny stock, going public. I didn't know what the hell that meant. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, I met this guy. His name is Peter Kolokoris. And he says, when you meet him, Frank, I'm telling you, he's not going to be that impressive. But he's got this knack for being able to take companies public. So I knew nothing about it. Charlie barely knew how this would work. So one day he introduces me to this guy, and he's this kind of Mr. Bean, the Greek version of Mr. Bean, goofy, with ill-fitting clothes, it's a movie like this with this Greek accent. And he comes into the office in Rochester, and he says, well, here's how we did it. He had managed to get these group of small brokerage firms behind him to take his Greek fast food restaurants public via a penny stock offering. And he had one in Buffalo, and he had one in Rochester, and he had one in Syracuse. And he figured out how to get these guys together, put an offering together, and have them sell stock and get his franchise going and open these restaurants. So he mapped it all out for Charlie and me. Here's how you do it. I've got the brokerage firms. These are the guys that can. So we began this process of learning what this meant, what this was all about. And he guided us, and we had these small brokerage firms ready to take us public. They were going to sell our stock on NASDAQ for 10 cents a share. And on that basis, we were hopefully going to be able to raise $4.7 million to make Lady in White independently, all in. So the process begins. I'm really, it's so detailed, this thing, but in any case, these brokerage firms are not the most reliable or prestigious films. I mean, these guys are really way out there. Most of the time, these penny stocks were just scams. They never did anything to speak of. But we sincerely were going to make a movie if we could pull this off. We were going to do this. So that shocked them in and of itself, that we weren't trying to scam anybody, that we were really going to do something if they took us public. So we had a bunch of these smaller firms that this Greek guy, Pilar Kolokoris, had managed to pull together to his aims and to meet his aims, and they started selling our stock. And so people could invest. Investors could invest for 10 cents a share. You could invest as much as you wanted to. This was kind of like the first crowdfunding approach toward making a movie, although crowdfunding, nobody knew what the hell that was. But we had to go public. We had to get the SEC's approval. We had to put together a public offering. It took a long time to do that. And then these brokers came on board and they started to pitch the stock. And we put together a promo reel to promote Lady in White, basically, that I could use for the brokers, about a 10-minute long, less than that, reel. We shot it in 35. Catherine Hellman had become a friend, and she agreed to appear in the promo reel. But the rest of the cast, with the exception of, I think, Lucy Lee Flippin, who played Miss Ladella, the teacher, she was in the promo reel. She was a friend of mine. They didn't portray the same roles in the feature. But I had this 35 millimeter print, this promo reel that we shot. We invested about 10 grand in, and I was flying all over the country to these various brokerage firms, setting up screenings in their local theaters and having these brokers come in to look at this promo reel to gas them and get them going on selling the stock. So they began to sell the stock. It opened at 10 cents a share. And eventually the stock went as high as 36 cents a share as the picture was being made, and it eventually got released. So there's something I want to say about A Lady in White it relates to this, as to its financial success, because it's generally considered to have been a failure financially. That's not the case at all. Eventually, we raised that $4.7 million in this manner. People, as I said, who bought the stock bought in whenever they bought in, at whatever price it was trading at NASDAQ at the time. So if you bought the stock early on at 10 cents, right, and you sold it at 20 cents when it went up to 20 cents, you made twice your money. You didn't have to wait for the movie to come out. You could have sold it anytime you wanted. Some people did wait for the movie to be finished. They were hoping for, larger returns. Some people did not. The stock never got any higher than 36 cents a share. The reason being, we had to sell a lot of stock. They were penny stocks, so there was a lot of stock out there. So that huge amount of stock eventually, $4.7 million worth of penny stock, 10-cent shares, 12-cent shares, 20-cent shares, meant we had an enormous amount of stock up there, and there was never any possibility of the stock even getting to $1 or $2, something like that. But it didn't matter. If you bought in at 10 and you sold at 36, you made almost 4 times your money, right? It depended on when you bought in, when you sold. You could also lose money if you bought in at 20 and you sold at 50. But it wasn't dependent, they're making money, the investors, wasn't dependent on what the film even did financially, theatrically, or in any other markets. So it was kind of interesting, more than interesting. It was beautiful because what eventually happened was it took me a year after the picture was finished to make the distribution deals I needed to make money on the picture, to get all of the negative costs back, the $4.7 million, and make a considerable amount of money, more than that, for our company. And in the first year, that was the toughest time of all with Lady in White, because everybody turned me down. You hear this all the time. The Coen brothers with Blood Simple, everybody turned them down. You know, it happens all the time. But it was a grueling year. The best offer I got for the picture after we'd spent $4.7 million making it, and it was all finished, it was done, was $120,000 from a little video company called Vestron. Everybody else had turned me down. And all the major studios had seen it, and they all turned me down. So, but I wasn't about to give up. I brought in an attorney friend of mine who happened to be one of the recently become a partner at O'Melveny & Myers, big firm, entertainment, not exclusively entertainment in Los Angeles. But Chris was really sharp. And I told Charlie, I said, we've got to work with him from the start to secure these deals, because I'm not going to allow what happened with Fear No Evil. I'm not going to allow the picture to be harmed in any way, and we're not going to walk away losing our shirts on this. So after a year, eventually, with Chris's assistance, I managed to secure a $2 million guarantee from Virgin Vision solely for the VHS video rights and theatrical rights in England and in the US as relates to video rights, theatrical and video in England. It was a British company. It was Richard Branson's. He actually had an entertainment arm. It was called Virgin Vision. And the picture, they guaranteed me a $2 million advance solely for home video rights in the US and in England, and theatrical rights in England, if I could get a theatrical distributor to release the film and spend $1 million in America solely on its release. So eventually, again, it's a long story, I got New Century Vista, got them to commit to $1 million spent solely for theatrical. They didn't have TV. No, wait, they had TV, US. But they didn't have VHS. There was only VHS at that time. They didn't have home video. They didn't have foreign. And then I made a deal with Goldwyn, the Samuel Goldwyn Company, wherein they advanced me $1 million. Plus, we made a deal whereby we secured 70% for foreign. They were going to sell the film all over the world. And we would receive 70% of all foreign sales. They would receive 30%. So before the picture even opened theatrically, before anybody even heard of Lady in White, we had recouped the full $4.7 million. All of it. And we didn't have to pay the backers a dime, because the backers made their money with the stock. So where did that money go? a part of it went into the company, of course, but a good deal of it into our pockets too, because we had deals in that regard. And the other part of it is, once Goldwyn went out and sold the picture foreign, it went through the roof for an independent film. It was one of their best-selling films. I have articles from Variety. So we pocketed another 3 to 4 million. So all this bullshit about, Lady Di, you go to the Internet Movie Database, it says the film only grossed $1.7 million. It's true. It did gross theatrically. It didn't do well theatrically. We didn't fucking care. We had almost $8 million in our pockets.
Yeah, that's wild.
And that's the truth of the matter. So we had obligations. We developed other projects. I came to Italy to write The Giant. We were living high up the hog. Charlie made some. I won't get into what happened to a lot of that money, but the point is, the film was far from not being a success. The film was a tremendous success for us, and then of course it became a success, which was most important to me. It was a creative success. It was, the reviews were, if they weren't glowing, they were at least more than positive.